One, two, one, two. All right. So this is going to be a recording which I'm just going to try to put some ideas that I have on the concept of history and historians in a society in which history is basically censored. This is going to be mostly for people who are already working on the project with me. If you are new to the project and you just clicked on this because I posted on YouTube next to the other thing and you have no idea what on God's good earth I'm talking about, this will probably be rather confusing. So I apologize for that in advance. So in the parallel project that Reconnaissance people are working on, they have determined that the character that would be the equivalent of a Twilight Velvet, this is Twilight Sparkle's mother and Nyx's grandmother, is basically a historian. So since we already had determined previously that her grandfather, Nightlight, was an astronomer, I asked if I could keep that and use her as a historian as well. And of course they said yes, and therefore in my version as well, in the story I'm working on, she is now a historian. And that's actually a really interesting thing. That was a very interesting reason why I wanted to do that. I mean, on a gut level, I come from a family of educators, and it really appeals to me. If Twilight Sparkle's family members are both academics, it makes things a lot very, very easy for me as well. But the concept of her being a historian is kind of funny, because I didn't say this at the time when they said that. But my original reaction when they said that she was a historian was, historians exist in Equestria. That's very strange. And by that, I quite literally mean this is a profession that you are legally allowed to have in Equestria. How? Again, this will be, because I'm going to speak here as if you're a member of my team here, while trying simultaneously not to completely obliterate any interest in the story by revealing everything. So, it has been a long-standing joke for me that there are no historians in Equestria. And this is, or they don't teach history in Equestria. And this is based on, really, just the ending of the first episode of the pilot, where no one's ever heard of Princess Luna, and they're like, sister, and you're also surprised that Celestia has a sister. Like, okay. So, right there from the word go, it seems like Celestia, once Luna fell to her madness and became Nightmare Moon, and she used the single most relevant word in the world at this moment. It's March 30th, 2020. All of you in the future. When Luna was sent to the moon and placed, to use the most relevant word in the world right now, under quarantine, because that is what she was done. It's been confirmed now officially, which, no duh, but now it's official that that's what was happened. It's like everyone forgot she existed. And I guess Celestia didn't really want everybody to walk around gossiping about her crazy sister stuck on the moon. So she just let them. And I'm talking here about canon MLP film. And so, no one knows who the hell she is when she shows up in the beginning of the story. And it's revealed that she is Celestia's sister. And from that moment on, I've always joked that they don't have history in Equestria. Because I'm a gigantic history buff, and it's kind of hilarious to think of a place where history seems to not exist. And from a very kind of calm way, it makes a lot of sense for history not to be a thing in canon Equestria, and also in our story, but our story has another reason, of course, which we'll get to in a moment. And that's the one that's very simple, and is the fact that things really don't change, right, in Equestria. The rate of societal transformation in Equestria seems to be very, very slow. The Equestria that a typical pony dies in, even if they're a spectacularly ancient one like Granny Smith, is basically the same one that they grew up in. Equestria is a world that doesn't have wars, except in our story, of course, but we'll get to that. It's a world in which the same literal person has been sitting as the absolute ruler of the country for well over 1,000 years. And it's a world that doesn't really seem to have much in terms of technological development. Like, they have telegraphs, and they have an electric power station, and they have trains, but they don't really have like high tech that moves very quickly, right? Because they have magic, so there's no need for it to develop. So because of this, history of Equestria isn't really the only things, I guess, that would change Equestria in the way that it's depicted in the show is the expansion of trade routes, which would lead to trade and travel and immigration and emigration and so on. And that's really the only thing that would change Equestria. But if you live outside of the trade routes, like in a place like Ponyville, you don't really need history. I mean, as far as you know, Celestia's always been the ruler, and the technological development has always been the same, and the structure of society has always been the same. History is of crucial importance in societies in moments of cataclysm and moments of very dynamic change, right? That's the famous George Santayana quote about, "They who do not know history are condemned to repeat it." Well, think about that. "They who do not know history are condemned to repeat it" implies that history is that there's like negative events that happen, cataclysms, and you're condemned to repeat them because you don't learn from them. There are no cataclysms on a societal scale depicted in the canon show, Friendship is Magic. It's just not a thing that happens. There's people who live in wilderness areas, like, for example, close to the Everfree Forest, and they have to deal with, like, hydras that might come up and eat you. There's that, but there's really no societal cataclysms. The threats that emerge really do emerge from completely outside Equestria, right? Like, so you don't have to have an understanding of the development of Equestrian history in order to understand Equestria as a citizen or subject of Equestria. Fine. But now we have a character who is a historian. And this is really, really juicy for me. Because how is she a historian? What does that mean? So for starters, for people who don't know this, it's important to distinguish what a historian is, as opposed to a history teacher. It may very well be that when people say, "Oh, Twilight Velvet is a historian," they mean she reads from a history textbook to some kids. That's not what a historian does. In canon, My Little Pony, probably the episode where you get to see a little bit of what a historian does is in the first episode when the Crystal Empire shows up, and Twilight Sparkle has to go to the Crystal Empire library and do research there. That's a lot closer to what a historian does. A historian is essentially an investigator who tries to figure out what things were like at a certain point in time, what happened, how it happened, and why. So a historian would not be somebody who reads a history book and says, "The Black Plague changed the dynamics of serf-peasant relations in 14th century France." In other words, a person who reads that sentence out loud to an AP European history class is not a historian. They're a history teacher, perhaps, but they're not a historian. The historians are the ones who helped write that book, and their job was to discover what the effects of the Black Plague were in 14th century France. And it turns out that the effects, as discovered by the historians of the Black Plague in 14th century France, were that it changed the dynamics of labor, the relationships between serfs and their feudal lords that ruled over them. And indeed, the Black Plague is believed to have been the foundational event that caused the collapse of feudalism as we know it in France Italy and England, Germany. So what they would do is that they would go and find, because this is the 14th century, this would almost certainly be in the records of the Roman Catholic Church, which was really the only entity that kept written records of everything in the medieval ages. And they would go look for what were called Domesday books, and these would basically be books that were like recounting of like property and basically like property transactions. And from this they could see what it was like before the Black Plague and then after the Black Plague, and they could see how it changed and how there was a dynamic change, and how the fact that 60% of the population died caused this massive labor surplus that had existed in agricultural society to become a contraction, where in fact there was now a labor shortage, and how this fundamentally changed the relationship between the labor, that is the serfs / peasants, and the feudal lords, which would be the employers. So the historian's job is going and finding those Domesday books and reading those books and analyzing those books and studying those books, and then from there going ahead and synthesizing the story of how the relationship between the feudal lords and the serfs changed in 14th century France as a result of the depopulation of the countryside caused by the Black Death. So the historian goes out and investigates and finds these contemporary records that existed and were written at the time of the events. These are called primary source materials. Primary source materials. And then the historian might use narratives of the time and might use these primary source materials, and then they create their work, which is called a secondary source material. And it's this secondary source materials which then get coalesced by other editors into history textbooks. So it's the actual investigation of going out there and finding these primary source materials, which is what a historian does. Historians are very much like archaeologists, except that archaeologists, of course, involve actual physical objects. Historians tend to do a lot more work with written records where they exist, or oral traditions where they exist, or whatever kind of primary source materials you can get, usually in a sort of narrative sense, as opposed to in a more kind of forensic, materialistic sense of archaeology. But still, that's the point, though. A historian is not somebody who edits a history textbook. A historian is somebody who goes and finds the primary source materials that will then create the secondary source materials, which will then be edited into history textbooks. So, if you are a historian by trade, you pick a period in time, and you go and you find stuff about it, and you use the primary source materials to get that. That's what historian does. The question becomes, what is the role of a historian in an absolute monarchy that has control over information? As we have discussed previously, in this form of Equestria that we are working in, it's a benevolent dictatorship. And you might be tempted to say it's a benevolent dictatorship where Celeste and Luna each have the same level of power that Kim Jong-un has over North Korea, or that Stalin had over the Soviet Union. That's not correct. I think it's probably more accurate to say that they're much closer to King Louis XIV, right? I mean, he was even a Sun King, so it's almost a direct parallel, right? The Sun King, who of course famously stated, "L'État c'est moi, I am the state," which is definitely a sentence that fits Celeste and Luna. They are the state, basically. They are the law. They are the law. They create the legislation. There is no legislature as far as we can tell. There is no. It's all decrees from on top. And because it is a decree from on top, these are dictates. These decrees, and that's where the word dictator comes from. And so they're dictators. Now, of course, they are benevolent dictators, because this is not human society where absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is magical talking cartoon horseland, and in magical talking cartoon horseland, they can be whatever they can be. Now, again, due to the very nature of the story, as you know, Alicorns, in order not to be a spoiler, which I'm not going to go into too much detail here, they have to have kind of what we call embrace their virtues. So we know that if they've been there for this long time, they are going to have already sort of embraced this virtue. Actually, you know what? Screw it. I'm not gonna say no spoilers. I'm just gonna like go ahead and spoil it because it's gonna be really hard to discuss if I don't do spoilers. And what are the chances that some random person, if I put this on YouTube, and I probably will, I'm just gonna put some disclaimer over there being like, hey, if you have any interest whatsoever in reading this multi-novel project that's been 5 years in the cooking, don't listen to this because you're gonna find out the backstory. Okay, so spoilers, leave now. Well, no, not yet, but spoilers. So, again, and the problem here is though that it's like the 14th, with the 14th. So it's not really an absolute totalitarian dictatorship like what you got in North Korea. By which I mean is, if you live in a place, I mean, the absolute totalitarian dictatorship manual is of course what's depicted in George Orwell's 1984, where the government has complete control over everything, can literally be spying on you at every moment, can be reading, can basically be trying to basically read your thoughts and read your emotions, and have a complete total control of who you are from moment A to moment B. And this, of course, is what is attempted in places like North Korea. Now, in other words, the government, the dictatorship, takes a proactive approach in your life. It interferes in your life in a very proactive manner. That's very clearly not Equestria. Thank God, right? But that's very clearly not Equestria. Equestria is more laissez-faire. It's more, there's this dictatorship, and they control everything that has to happen at the national level. But if you live in Ponyville and you have a farm, and, Princess Celestia isn't gonna, dictate how, I guess there is taxation, but there wouldn't be it's not going to be like a day-to-day thing where, you have to wake up in the morning and you have to praise the sun, and then you have to, do the 2 minutes hate, and then you have to do, you have to have a portrait of Princess Celestia in your house, and the secret police can break at any moment and they'll arrest you and drag you away to be tortured forever in room 101 if you don't have a portrait of Celestia in your house. I mean, it's not that kind of totalitarian dictatorship. But it is a dictatorship in the sense that there are some worlds, some parts of human existence, or pony existence, I guess, that do brush up against the interests of Celestia and Luna. And if they brush up against the interests of Celestia and Luna to the point where they can determine that you are a threat to the social order, you don't want to be in that position. And there's just about no job in Equestria that would put you in that position faster and more spectacularly than being a historian. Again, not somebody who reads a history textbook aloud to students, a historian who investigates through primary source materials. And why? Well, again, here's a spoiler alert. Alicorns, Celestia, Luna, Starlight Sparkle, Cadence, Nyx, Flurry Heart, Hyperion, Dinky's grandfather who Nyx marries 10,000 years down the road. All of these characters. They're Alicorns. And Alicorns, historically, previous to Luna and Celestia, were civilizational threats to Equestria. They would basically hit a point in which they would transform into fully wild Alicorns, or FWAs, or I think natural wild, NWAs. There's an acronym that Recon uses that always makes me laugh when I see it. That was a very bad thing, because a fully wild Alicorn is amoral, not immoral, amoral, meaning that the concept of morality and ethics themselves, these concepts literally mean nothing. They're completely incomprehensible. And they're also basically demigods. And so they can basically destroy civilization, and in fact that is what they do. When an immoral Alicorn happens, they destroy civilization. Now, usually, what happens is these immoral Alicorns occur only once every so often. And so, a great cataclysm occurs, usually triggered by the immoral Alicorn, or the immoral Alicorn gets bored with living in Equestria and leaves. Apparently they can go through outer space. I have not been told how this works. I just know that, for example, Dinky's grandfather left for outer space and was there for like 10,000 years until Nick showed up, and then they had cute Alicorn babies eventually. But Alicorns were always a horrible mismatch with Equestria. So then Hyperion and Harmony show up. Harmony is his wife's name? Oh god, I hope his wife's name is Harmony. I'm not in a position to look it up right now, and I sound like an idiot if it's not Harmony. Hyperion and Harmony show up, and it's the first time ever that there's two Alicorns at the same place. So they meet and they fall in love, they marry, blah blah blah, and they have and of course Harmony kind of pays attention to the ponies, whereas Hyperion just basically sees them as ants that get in the way of its majestic natural creations, and blah blah blah, stuff to be detailed later. Luna and Celestia are born, and the thing that's important about Luna and Celestia is that Luna and Celestia find a way to break the cycle. Luna and Celestia find out that the way you break the cycle is you have to identify with a virtue and basically live that virtue. And if you live that virtue, that grounds you in a sense of morality and ethics, and you don't become this amoral being who runs around basically killing things. This puts Luna and Celestia in a horrible bind, because what it means is that Luna and Celestia are the only ones who know the true nature of an Alicorn. And they have to keep the true nature of Alicorns a secret. Why? Well, imagine that you were a pony of any responsible form who has the ability or the talent to convince other ponies to do things. And you find out that Alicorns historically have always led to either the abandonment of the planet or the destruction of pony civilization. What is your most logical course of action? Your most logical course of action is to go underground, create a small army, and assassinate Celestia and Luna at your nearest opportunity. That's the most logical course of action you can possibly take, is to assassinate the Alicorns. And then, in the future, if any Alicorns show up, kill them immediately. Problem is that, one, people may forget about the Alicorns, because again, usually thousands and thousands of years happen between them. But two, Celestia and Luna have the cure. And they also perceive themselves, since they help bring down their parents, or their father. Alright, continuing. So, actually I want to double back a little bit on the whole Luna and Celestia having the cure thing. I think that's very interesting here, and that we're not really exploring, probably to the level that we should be exploring, is that this is a benevolent dictatorship, right? And absolute power corrupts, absolutely, but why does the power not corrupt Luna and Celestia? Absolutely. And the reason, again, it comes from their Alicorn nature. So ponies may be morally better slightly than human beings, but that would be a question of degree, not of character. They might be slightly more social, slightly less violent, slightly more loving, slightly more charitable, slightly in all your virtues here. But they clearly can still commit all of the moral fallacies that humans do. And they have to, because otherwise we don't have a story. So if we're creating a world in order for us to have a narration, nobody writes stories about heaven, right? Nobody sits down and writes an amazing story that is a depiction of the daily life in heaven or in any other perfectly moral place that you can imagine. And the same reason now Superman is the most difficult superhero to write for. I mean, if everyone in heaven is a saint, you don't want to write a story about saints. Unless you're writing a story about the saint being murdered. Because there's no conflict. So in order for us to have conflict, they have to have the same moral problems that humans have. Which means that if they are given absolute power, eventually it will absolutely corrupt them. but not Celestia and Luna. Celestia and Luna are immune. And the reason they are immune is because they are so firmly rooted in that. It doesn't mean that they're perfect, right? They commit all kinds of horrible mistakes. But it does mean that they are immune to complete corruption due to power. And that is because they have identified with their virtues. Had they not identified with their virtues, it would be much worse. But they have an ability, having identified with the Alicorns have an ability, having identified with their virtues, that other ponies don't. So there is value from the point of Celestia and Luna for there to be Alicorns. And they are the ones that have the cure to making Alicorns safe. And they are also the ones that have, being Alicorns, they're also the ones who are in the best position to fight against Alicorns that need to be destroyed. After all, as far as Celestia and Luna can tell, all the Alicorns previous to her father, who attacked Pony Society, as far as I can recall, were pretty much successful. They could not be stopped. Hyperion was the first one to be stopped purposefully, as opposed to through some sort of self-caused damage, and that was because of Luna and Celestia were there. So they're there, one, because they have this ability to rule without being completely corrupted. Two, the reason they have the ability to rule without being corrupted is because they have identified with virtue. Three, the reason they have identified with virtue is because that's the way that you stop Alicorns, starting with themselves, from becoming amoral. Four, since they have this identified virtue, they can cure other Alicorns. And five, if there is no cure possible, they are in the best position to mount a defense against a dangerous Alicorn. So that's 5 reasons why Celestia and Luna would rather you not assassinate them today. Thank you. But again, the single most sane reaction to a complete and total knowledge of the relationships of Alicorns vis-a-vis the other tribes of ponies is the extermination of any Alicorn that you can find. And for the 5 reasons I just enumerated, Celestia and Luna, and apart obviously from self-preservation and wanting to create, once they start reproducing naturally, meaning once Flurry Heart is born, that brings another interesting kerbobble. Because, well, actually, once Lixen Luna is born, now you know that you can have Alicorns be born. But once Flurry Heart is born, there's also the idea that you can just have Alicorn families. And obviously, you don't want to exterminate those either. So what this means is Celestia and Luna manipulate history. In other words, there is just about no understanding in pony society about this fact that Alicorns have historically driven cycles. They have been historical cycles that end with an Alicorn absolutely wrecking the everlasting crap out of civilization on planet Equus. And this conflict, hiding the nature of Alicornness, is the conflict that, spoiler alert, is the conflict that drives the undercurrent under which the story I am writing is being told. And of course it also will later function in Blackfeather, because it's Nyx becoming aware of these things and of the nature of her own Alicornness and of the nature of how Nightmare Moon was created that will cause her main conflict in that story, which I'm trying to lay a foundation for in this story. So the climax of my story, which I'm in the process right now of writing, actually of completely outlining and writing, since we all have to stay inside so we don't die from the coronavirus. It's not a joke for me. I have severe asthma. I actually probably would very likely die. I've had 7 pneumonias in my life, and I know that I'm going to die of a pneumonia because my lungs are malformed since I was born 2.5 months premature. So in my particular case, I literally do have to stay inside or I will die. That's not the corona, I promise. Which is very, that's why I snort a lot. That sound that you hear in my recordings, yeah, I have breathing problems, always done my entire life. I've since become something of a long distance power walker. I wouldn't even call myself a runner, and swim a lot, but that's because my lungs are my weak point. So I know I'm going to die of a pneumonia, but I'd rather not do it this year. Now, going back to Fantasyland. Oh God, where was I? So they've hidden the history, and this lies on. Right, the climax of my story. The climax of my story involves a bunch of things having to do with this project that's being built underneath Nightstone Castle, which is the castle that was built for Nyx during past sins, and they're basically hollowing out areas down there because they are continuing the project that exists in past sins, so there's glow in the dark plants, and as they are continuing the process of the glow in the dark plants, they stumble onto some ruins. And these ruins turn out to be the ruins of the original Ponyville version 1.0, which nobody knows existed, which was destroyed by Nightmare Moon when Nightmare Moon possessed Luna's form. Before, like 1400 years previously, before the elements of magic wielded by Celestia obliterated that form of Luna, and she got a one-way 1400-year shelter-in-place order on the moon. Oh wow, all these coronavirus references are going to sound really dated to people who are not alive in the last week of March of 2020. Anyways, but she does get quarantined to the moon. That's literally what happens. Now the key there, of course, is that nobody knows that those ruins are there. Because Celestia doesn't... since she's already hiding all the records of what Alicorns did before, why not just hide as much as you could about what her sister did? So the fact that original Ponyville 1.0 was sort of like this readout where a lot of Celestia loyalists hid and were basically genocided. They were just wiped out of the face of the planet, with extreme prejudice, by Luna/Nightmare Moon. It's the thing that's been hidden for history, and nobody knows that until they find these ruins. And so the whole intrigue driving the climax of my story is that there's this project in which these ruins are being dismantled. And it's such a priority to keep it secret that the ruins are being dismantled in a way that the ruins are actually being kind of like taken apart and then taken through an underground train that's been built to a facility that's being built in the caverns that are beneath Mount Canterlot, and they're being destroyed there, so that nobody in Ponyville can find it. And because this is me, and I was rereading the Andromeda Strain because it's such a timely read right now, and I realized I write in the Michael Crichton style, Michael Crichton mechanism, not the style. Like if I emulate anybody prose-wise, it's probably Ray Bradbury. I don't like the way Michael Crichton's prose writes, but if you read books like Jurassic Park or the Andromeda Strain, Michael Crichton's books are very much like, and now here's a problem, and here's how you're going to solve that problem. That turns out to be the things I write. So a whole bunch of the whole climax of my story involves all of the layers of secrecy. For example, the ponies that volunteer to work have to volunteer to get their minds basically erased, and then there's a unicorn who is the one who works erasing their minds, and the only way that unicorn got that job is because that unicorn has terminal cancer. so that unicorn will soon go to the grave, and that unicorn that has terminal cancer is the one that has the job of mind wiping these people with a temporary mind wipe, so that they go in, they go leave their shift and don't remember what they did in the shift, which is explained to them, like they know they're going to be mind wiped. And all of this happens, and there's all these layers and 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 layers of secrecy to make sure that this facility is dismantled. Because basically, one, they don't want anybody, the sisters don't want anybody to know what is in this facility. And two, what happened was when Nightmare Moon destroyed it, immediately after she got quarantined to the moon, Celestia covered the whole thing with sand really quickly. And so there's blatantly stolen from the Chernobyl miniseries, which is actually what I watched immediately, and that's literally what gave me like the mood that I wanted for the climax. It's not radioactivity, obviously, but the best thing I can call it is magical radioactivity, and so they can't have the project next to it, the plant project, because this magical radioactivity is harmful to any pony, but especially unicorns that are exposed to it. And obviously they need unicorns to be working down there with this magical plants and stuff, and earth ponies too, but unicorns. And so they have to remove all of these magically radioactive ruins before they can finish everything in there, because otherwise they're basically a health hazard. But at the same time, it has to be removed in a way that's very secretive. And if you see how incredibly convoluted this is, that's one, I'm not going to simplify it, because that's what gave me a climax. Because like I said, I write in the Michael Crichton style, where I have now posed 76 problems that I have to solve, and my climax is that I solve the 76 problems. And I'm actually really happy with the outline for it. It seems really good. But again, okay, so what's going to happen in the climax, of course, is that our main characters are going to be exploring underneath Camelot Castle for a project that they have that involves, basically they discovered that Camelot Castle is, it can't stand the laws of physics, would have it collapse, and the only reason it can stand is because at the bottom of Camelot Castle in the foundations there are these sigil runes which are encoded, and they're basically taking a class on runes, are using runes for arithmancy. So the way this works is that basically arithmancy is basically magical mathematics. Each of these runes has like a piece of basically software code which runs an algorithm, which runs an ever-repeating magical spell that doesn't require a spellcaster to be there. So it's like if you had a unicorn there 24/7, but instead the algorithm in the rune causes that to happen, and then that's what lays the foundation of Camelot Castle. And this is known, this is not a secret of any kind. And so our fearless tutors who are taking a basic class on how to build those, as basically like they're elected during their freshman year at Pony MIT, which that's the school of gifted unicorns, but I call it Pony MIT when I'm not writing it down. They go looking for it, and this is how Nix and Rumble and Dinky and the still nameless kid, basically they end up finding the Camelot side of this ruined situation, and then Rumble falls into the minecart that's used to transfer the ruins, and there's a magical thing, so it just scoots in after him, and this basically transports them to underneath Ponyville, blah 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 blah, and then the climax happens. If you're still with me after all of that, and again, that's the climax of my story, so you're gonna get into it when I write it. The important thing there is the secrecy. So the secrecy is vital to everything. So this is a world of secrets. It's a world of lies. But it's also a world, and it's a world where the most dangerous thing you can do in terms of getting into potentially lethal trouble with the absolute dictators that run your land, who otherwise would love nothing more than to hug and caress and cheer you on because they are literally the nicest people imaginable. I mean, Slim and Celestia, like, they're basically Team Mom for the entire planet. They're literally the nicest, most decent ponies imaginable. But if you ever thought to yourself, I'm a pony, how can I get Luna or Celestia to kill me? Right, let's assume that you want to commit suicide by Alicorn. Well, I suppose the most obvious way would be to physically attack a pony or any sentient being in a way that try to commit a murder, basically, in front of Celestia and Luna, and not stop and make it clear that you're just gonna kill that whoever you're trying to murder, unless you're killed first, and then Celestia and Luna kill you, in order to save the life of the person of the entity you were trying to murder. I guess that's the obvious way of doing it, right? And obviously if you do that in front of Nyx, the same thing would happen. And the same thing would happen in front of Cadence, probably, and definitely in front of Shining Armor, probably in front of Twilight Sparkle. In fact, there's probably a long list of ponies that would that would kill you in order to stop you from murdering someone else. I mean, that's actually, so that's not unique. That's not something that would get you killed specifically from the top. That's just general shitty behavior that would probably result in your death. But again, it's the question, like, how do you get murdered by the most benevolent dictators imaginable? Well, I know the answer to that question. Do you? If you're working for me in my project, in this project, you probably do, but I'm going to say it. The way you find out the truth, the way that you get murdered by Celestia and Luna, is that you find out the truth about Alicorns. And you're not an Alicorn. And you're not like... No, yeah, and you're not an Alicorn. That's the way to get murdered. If Celestia and Luna, if you are not an Alicorn, or so incredibly tied to an Alicorn, like Twilight Sparkle is to Nyx before Twilight Sparkle herself becomes an Alicorn. And you find out the truth about Alicorns. The truth about Alicorns being that they will destroy society unless they identify with their virtue. I imagine that if Luna and Celestia know that you have a chance of talking about that, they would have to murder you. You would die. You would be killed. Maybe it would be, they're super all-powerful, so maybe it would look like a heart attack. Maybe it would look like a accident. Maybe they would personally kill you. Maybe they would arrange for someone else to kill you in a way that didn't look like a murder, but you would die. And you can speculate to whichever scenario you prefer, that they've already killed somebody. Or maybe they haven't. I don't know. If you want to think, maybe they already killed somebody, go right ahead. And if you want to think, no, they haven't had to make that horrible choice yet, go right ahead as well. It makes no difference whatsoever to the story. It's an interesting thing to think about, though. Have they already killed somebody over this? I don't know. I'm not saying that the answer is yes, because there's no... That's not the point of my story. I'm not saying the answer is yes. I'm saying the answer is possibly. Right? It may be... It's certainly a possibility, dude. So, being an archaeologist, being a historian, are probably the two careers most likely to put you into a collision course with the Royal Sisters in a way that is literally life-threatening to you. So what does it mean to be a historian under those circumstances? Alright, so I want to conclude this with that question. What does it mean to be a historian in those circumstances? I just wanted to note that I just reheard a part of this where I was talking about the climax of the story. I state several times in it that the facility is being removed in a secretive manner. What's being removed is the ruins of Ponyville 1. The facility is what was being created when they stumbled onto Ponyville 1. And the facility is just basically like an underground football field that they're using to grow these plants that don't need sunlight for a theoretical event called Project Eclipse, which would be sort of like a doomsday device ending for any potential war. Alright, so what I want to talk about now is what does it mean from the point of view of a historian to live in a world where history itself is being manipulated. In other words, there is a certain point X in time. Oh, actually several certain points X in time. But as you go back in time, the further back in time you go, the more manipulated history is. Note that this is different than saying the more back in time, the fewer primary sources you have. That's just simply true for all historians in the real world, right? We know less about France 3,000 years ago than we know about France 30 years ago, simply because there's fewer recording ways of things being recorded, and the primary materials degrade over time and so on. That obviously also happens in Equestria, but there's the second level later, which is Luna and Celestia are hiding the past because of the truth about Alicorns, because they need to keep that secret. That means that beyond a certain point X, Luna and Celestia want to be literally the sole sources of information. And I have to reread that encyclopedic article that's written about this. I think it's literally called The Story So Far. To remember when precisely that is. But at some point after Hyperion's defeat, Luna, I remember, is the one that went throughout the world, basically gathering all the things of Hyperion together and using what they could do to research an Alicorn killing weapon, and then basically destroying the rest. And then obviously, given the events of the pilot, at some point, even things involving Nightmare Moon and things like that have been covered up, right? Like, for example, it's key in my story that Nightmare Moon basically genociding, mass slaughtering the inhabitants of Ponyville version 1.0 is a secret. Because no one knows that in my story. In fact, it's not said at any point in my story that what the ruins that they have found are the ruins of Ponyville 1.0. That actual sentence, what you found here were the ruins of the original form of Ponyville, which was destroyed by Nightmare Moon, that never appears in my story. It's actually a secret in the end of my stories. It's meant to be revealed at some point in Blackfeather as part of the antagonist's way of breaking Nyx in that story. So that was hidden. And there's little scraps that are hidden. For example, in my story, it's the Nightmare Moon statue that appears in Luna Eclipsed. That's the key that eventually should show you that something's happening. And of course, then they find this tunnel. Even though they don't go looking for it, but that's the foreshadowing of that statue, and a minor mystery that will be built up around that. That's being built up around that. But what this looks like is, when you are a historian, the farther and farther you go to point X, the less and less you have. And again, that's the same here, but more than that, the less and less you have, and the more tightly it's controlled by Celestia. Now, prior to the events of my story, there were two events that really, really must have revolutionized the practice of historians in Equestria. The first of this, of course, was the return was when Celestia let Nightmare Moon out of her quarantine and the whole events of the first of the pilot, because then all of these myths about Nightmare Moon now had validity, and now, oh well, here's sister. And I suppose Luna herself is another source of information. I assume that she has given interviews, quote unquote, with historians, but the smarter historians like Twilight Velvet would have known that those interviews come with caveats attached and may not be the best source of material. Now, I'm sure that some of the people who are listening to this are familiar with both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi Scrolls. In both of those cases, well, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the most well known. So, in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, whatever you want to call it, the Holy Land, the Levant, in the late 1940s, the same time as the Israeli independence war was going through, they found these scrolls, which were the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Dead Sea Scrolls are basically a series of religious texts, including the book of Daniel, and an apocryphal book of the Old Testament called the Book of Enoch, and several rules of living of an apocalyptic Jewish cult called the Essenes. And this was a huge revelation when this was revealed, because this was a view into what Judaism looked like at exactly the moment that Christianity was founded, because the time period of the Dead Sea Scrolls overlaps with the time period that it is believed that Jesus lived, and his immediate followers up to including Saul of Tarsus, who becomes the Apostle Paul, lived. So it was a window into the religious world in which Christianity was born, in the form of primary material that was actually written down in that period of time, right? Well, something like that, with much less religious significance, but on a much more massive scale, happens in Equestria. When the Crystal Empire comes back with that massive library that is a glimpse to the history of Equestria. up to just before Luna's transformation into Nightmare Moon. And so historians who have been primed to be suspicious, because just a year or two before Nightmare Moon had returned, now were given this huge library of information dating back to that period in time. And so for Twilight Velvet and other librarians, this was not one Holy Grail, this was an infinite number of Holy Grails. So they must have scoured that library up and down, looking for things. Now, of course, Luna would already have removed some of the more dangerous stuff from there, right? Because like I said, Luna went before Luna became Nightmare Moon, before the whole, before the Crystal Empire vanished. That's when the period of hiding all the stuff about the nature of the Alicorns happened. But still, the ability to sit there and chronologically go through things that are 1500, 1600, 1700, 1400, 1500, however old they are, would have been an absolutely revelatory moment for history as a profession, for historians as a group in Equestria, because it was a complete glimpse to an entire corpus, an entire library of hundreds of thousands of volumes, from what it appears in the show, of ancient writings that predated this already quasi-mythical time. Because again, remember, the average pony apparently didn't know that Luna was real. And here are writings from before when Luna became Nightmare Moon. So that would have been really interesting. So I'm part of this is to try to get ahead of Twilight Velvet as a historian. These earth-shaking events have happened: the return of return of Luna as Nightmare Moon, and then the reveal of the libraries in the Crystal Empire. And of course, the more they dig, the more they realize that there's something hidden. Now again, my story is a story of setup. Twilight Velvet never finds out the mystery of the Alicorns. He's never, as far as I know, she never finds out about the Alicorns unless Nyx tells her after the events of the main story. She certainly doesn't find out. No one outside of Luna and Celestia find out as a result of this kind of evidence during the period of my story. But that sense of there's something hidden here is what drives the underneath of the story, even though it's never revealed, because it's clear from my story that it's the prequel to another set of stories. That's the sense I want the reader to have, is that there's this engine that's being built underneath that will eventually lead to this reveal. So that's it. I think I'm done. Those are my thoughts on the practice of being a historian, and I hope that this is both useful to me and illustrative to anybody who reads this, especially within the team. Alright, I'm done. Bye.